Good evening, everyone. Today is May the 27th, and we have a very exciting and a very informative session for you today, presented by Gauri Goswami. As you all know, that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and mental health permeates to everyone: teenagers, kids, youth, adults, and senior citizens. So, today, the very important topic about discussing stress for teenagers. And I would like to welcome Gauri Goswami. Welcome, Gauri.
Hi, thank you.
Hey, Gauri, do you want to? I know our viewers have heard you before. Do you want to give a introduction about yourself and what this presentation is going to be?
I'm a therapist, I'm a social worker. I work with teens, I work with young kids. So maybe I'd say like 0 to 25ish is probably the majority of my clients. So I work with adults as well. I work full time at a nonprofit. And I work at a private practice, and then I have my own practice. So a really wide range of experiences. My specialty is really early childhood trauma, but I also do a lot with depression, anxiety, um, and some kind of life transition type of stuff. So hopefully this was helpful to everybody. The presentation is on teen stress. Um, and I hope, feel free to ask questions in the chat or, maybe at the end, I'm not sure whether you're able to unmute yourself and just ask, but if so, then feel free to do so. I will go ahead and share my screen right now so we can get started. Okay, so stress and healthy teen relationships. It's a pretty wide and broad topic, so I'll really try to touch on a few things today. So first of all, let's talk about mental health. Anyone can struggle with mental health. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is NAMI for short, 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses emerge by age 14 and 75% emerge by age 24. This is actually a really crucial time. Mental health conditions present differently by age group. So, for example, a lot of the time, depression can show up as irritability or anger in younger kids, which is a little bit different than how it looks in adults. In adults, it's a little bit more like sadness or apathy. Mental health conditions are complicated. So there are a lot of contributing factors: environmental, organic, genetic. For example, if you have a parent who has anxiety or depression, you're more likely to have anxiety or depression. Sometimes it can just, it's a brain chemistry thing. It can just show up. Environmental, certainly, if you experience a lot of trauma, you are most likely to, or more likely to experience mental health concerns, among other factors, right? Some warning signs of anxiety and depression: um, isolation, so self-isolation, irritability, changes in eating habits, changes in sleeping patterns. So that can be eating a lot or a little. That can be sleeping a lot or sleeping very little, having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Loss of interest in pleasurable activities. So things that, with kids, you can see, like if they really liked baseball, for example, and then all of a sudden they're not interested anymore and they don't want to do it. Difficulty concentrating. This is a big one for school-age children, I think you can usually see. Maybe they were able to kind of do their homework before, but you see that they're falling off. Difficulty making decisions. So feeling all of a sudden really indecisive. Like you ask what they want for lunch and they can't cope, or you ask what they want to wear for school that day in younger children and they just can't handle it, or what classes to pick for the next year, so on and so forth. Can be these kind of seemingly small decisions can feel huge and overwhelming to them. Panic attacks and trouble breathing. So a panic attack can feel a lot like a heart attack. So intense pain in the chest, tight pain in the chest, throbbing, difficulty breathing, hyperventilating. Or most explicitly talk of self-harm and suicidality. So I have a lot of parents that's kind of the first time that they consider therapy, when they learn that their child has been harming themselves, or they learn that their child has entertained thoughts of suicide. And I strongly encourage to be on the lookout for some of the signs that we talked about as early as possible, so that we can ideally get your child help prior to noticing these kind of more severe symptoms. So right now we're kind of in a weird space for mental health. I think COVID has been probably one of the most significant factors in affecting anxiety in particular and depression, because there's been isolation from friends and family. We're kind of all going through this big collective trauma together, right? Like, we're all experiencing this for the first time. Most of us haven't lived through a pandemic of any kind, and certainly not one of this magnitude before. School was disrupted, education was disrupted too. A lot of kids are having a hard time learning. Some kids are doing really well at online learning, but either way, it's a big transition. There was a huge lack of clarity and information, especially at the beginning. The rules are always changing. Even now, we don't have to wear masks. Do we have to wear a mask? It varies state by state. That's a huge loss of control, right? The future is unpredictable. That's always been true, but especially now, it's really kind of at the forefront that we don't really know what to expect. And I think for kids that can be really hard, because usually as a child or as a teenager, you look to adults to know what to do. And this is a situation where adults really have no idea what to do. And different families had different rules. So some people would be intensely isolated. Other people were kind of flouting the rules and doing whatever they wanted. So that was, I think, really hard. And now we're seeing a decrease in this as schools open up and as people are allowed to socialize a little bit more. But I guess the best way to combat this is find ways to create human connection, communicate clearly and validate feelings, offer more control and more choices. So by that, I mean within the home. And we'll talk more about choices a little bit later on, but we can't control what's outside of our space. So offering some safe methods of control inside of our space. I get asked this question quite a bit, how to talk to kids about mental health. So be clear and direct. Listen, that's a big one. Ask questions to clarify, and don't be afraid to ask about difficult or uncomfortable topics, right? So, for example, asking about suicide or self-harm does not encourage someone to engage in these acts, right? Asking about sex does not make your kid have sex. Asking about whatever is going on in their lives might be the only way that a child feels comfortable talking about it, right? Approaching these big, difficult topics with parents can actually be really, really challenging, right? Validate their feelings, right? So if they're like, oh, I'm so upset, I have no one to talk to, I'm sad, I'm angry, do not say that they should be grateful for what they have or question the authenticity of their feelings. So this is something I see a lot where, kids might be like, oh, I feel really sad. And they'll be like, no, you don't, everything's fine. But it's like this kid just said that they were sad, right? So we're not actually exploring why that might be. And a big, I cannot stress enough, I'll say again, when a child comes to you and is feeling depressed, to say to that child, hey, you have no reason to be depressed. Everything's fine. Like, you have food, you have an education, you have your family. Like, when I was your age, I didn't have any of those things. When I was your age, I was grateful for what I have, right? None of that is helpful. And what ends up happening is that you are teaching that child over and over again that they can't come to you when there's something seriously wrong. So you ask how you can help and offer suggestions. So I think sometimes if you don't know what can help, that's a good time to talk to a doctor or a mental health professional. But sometimes, if your kid is feeling really overwhelmed with school, maybe they need your help with organization. Maybe they just need to talk to you about it. Maybe, they're having trouble sleeping, so you can sit with them before they go to bed. There's a lot of options that you can engage with pretty early on that you might have solutions for, right? And you don't know unless you ask. So some helpful coping strategies that we'll talk more about, routines and structure. So especially for younger kids, but even for teenagers, having very clear consequences, very clear structure. Like, this is, if this is the expectation, if these are the chores, if this is the homework, whatever it is, to make sure that they know what's expected of them, right? If they're supposed to make their bed, if they're supposed to do the laundry, if they're supposed to do the dishes, whatever it is, they know ahead of time that they're supposed to do it, and they know what happens if they don't do it. So maybe if you don't do the dishes, you can't go out with your friends until they're done, right? Something else that's helpful is mood tracking and journaling. So helping kids make the connections between triggers and their coping skills. So for example, your kid may not realize that they're stress eating, right? But mood tracking or journaling is a good way to be like, okay, every time I'm sad, I eat a little bit more than I should because that's what makes me feel better, right? And even understanding, like, okay, when I'm feeling really stressed, that's when, like, I clench my jaw, I clench my fists, I get really hot. Okay, I'm feeling stressed. I need to figure out how I can calm down. Meditation is a big one, even if your child doesn't have mental health concerns. I think making that a part of a child's routine can be really helpful, even if that just means 5 deep breaths at the beginning of the day. Spending time outdoors, this can be hard, especially with teenagers, because I feel like so much of their social life is spent with electronics. But I would really encourage, if you can do that as a family, go outside, ride bikes, take a walk, whatever it is, but the entire family, get out of the house, do something good for all of you. Also, finding some creative ways to relationship build. So by this, what I mean is, like, sometimes you're not going to sit down with your kid and they're just not going to spill their heart out, right? Especially as they get older, that's just not a realistic goal, and that's okay, right? But I think for many kids, sometimes, if you're doing an activity together, so that can be an outdoor activity, that can sometimes be maybe if you see that they like to do art, if they like to do a puzzle, you can do that with them. Or sometimes it can be that you guys are both doing something different. Maybe they're doing their homework at the table while you're washing dishes. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be doing the same thing. You don't even have to be talking, but they need to see your presence and know that you're around and that you're a supportive person in their life. So this is one that I get asked a lot about, right? So, like, let's say your kid is going through a hard time, you know that. How do you balance that? Like, how do you have empathy for that while also understanding that, they do have to have consequences. Like, they can't just not do their homework because they're sad. I mean, maybe they can, but that might have long-term consequences, for example. So how do you do that? Or what if you have one child who is really struggling with their mental health and another child who's not, and so the child who isn't has a much higher capacity and can do so much more, right? So how do you balance that and make it so that nobody feels like that's really unfair? So the first thing is setting appropriate limits, right? If you know that your child's capacity is just like, they're just not going to be able to do 8 different things in a row, right? Then don't have that expectation, because then you're setting them up to fail, right? So have age appropriate, capacity appropriate expectations, and then consider, for their age, what is reasonable, right? So a teenager should, for the most part, if they are functioning on average, they should be able to take care of their homework. They should be able to do a few chores around the house. And they should be able to balance that with a social life and with respect for you, right? The consequences for that, I think, at that age, because they are getting to be a little bit more independent, you can state them ahead of time and be like, XYZ things need to be done before you can leave the house, right? If they are not done, you cannot go out with your friends. And that's a very clear, A plus B equals C situation, right? If this, then this. You can also empathize, right? If they're saying, like, oh, I'm so tired, I don't want to do this, this is too hard for me. You can say, like, yeah, like, that sucks, right? That sucks. Like, I'm sorry, like, that's really frustrating. That's really hard. You still have to do this anyway, right? And then so you can make it clear, right? Hey, I empathize. That's really tough. You also still have to do it. And then let's brainstorm together about ways that you can make it happen. Right? You can offer support, and you should offer support, but remember that we're also teaching life skills, right? So there's a difference between offering support and just having that mean that you run in and do it for them and you hold them all the way through, versus offering support and giving them a chance to do it by themselves. Because at this age, we're really facilitating independence. So independence at each age, at each developmental capacity looks different, right? Maybe for one kid, independence means doing their homework, having a job, having a social life, playing a sport, and doing all of that stuff, taking care of their siblings. For another kid, maybe independence just means that they get their homework done by themselves, right? Whatever is appropriate for your kid, that's where you want to hone in on it. Also, like, it's okay to be creative, right? For younger kids, you can have charts and stickers. You can give incentives. You can turn things into a game. One of my favorite games, for example, is like, if kids have like dirty clothes all over their room, you can have a hamper in there, and you can challenge them, like, see who makes the most like shots in the basket with their dirty clothes, right? Like, who can get them in the hamper more. Play music. Sometimes for kids, I'll play a song and then they have to clean up by the end. Sometimes when we have therapy sessions in person and there's a lot of toys, I'll play music at the end, a song of their choice, and everything has to be cleaned up by the end of the song. And it turns it into a game. It's a lot of fun. We dance at the same time, and kids really tend to enjoy it. For older kids, I recommend being really flexible with time. Your idea of do this right away and your teenager's idea of do this right away are really not the same thing. So I think kind of being understanding about that, and instead of having it be like, hey, all of this needs to be done right this second, or all this needs to be done by 4 o'clock. Maybe have it a little bit looser and be like, in order for you to do these fun things that you like, this stuff needs to be done. So if it's not done, that's fine. You can take your time, but then you also can't do these other fun things, which, if you think about it, is how we operate as adults. Self-care, it's a big buzzword. There's a lot about it, but I guess I would say to start with that taking care of yourself is crucial. You have to put on your own oxygen mask before you can help the person next to you, right? So this is important for both parents and children. So you, as the parent, need to model for your child how to rejuvenate and care for themselves, right? You can also model how to ask for help, right? I think that a lot of adults, and therefore a lot of kids, really struggle with asking for help. Like, it's really hard for us to be like, hey, I'm not doing so well, I need support, or hey, I don't know how to do this, can you help me? I don't understand this, can you help me? So if your child sees you doing it, they will also learn to do it. So for younger kids, sometimes that's super explicit. So you can say like, oh, you know what, I'm feeling really frustrated. I don't know, I can't find this in the store. Let's go ask somebody, right? For an older kid, really encouraging them, if they ask for help, reward that positively, help them to reinforce that positively, and really help them see that they're not by themselves, right? They don't have to rely only on themselves, that there are a lot of resources out there. So really encourage that and push them to do it. Also, take time for yourself. Being a parent is a really, really hard job, right? Caring for someone else is a really, really hard job. So make sure you take some time to recuperate. Create systems to eliminate unnecessary stress. So that means helping children be independent, both physically and emotionally. So if a child is struggling and they're sad or they're frustrated, giving them the tools to help themselves calm down first, and then eventually ask you for help. So maybe, for a kid, take 5 deep breaths, take a walk, listen to music. If you're still feeling bad, then come find me. Also have reasonable expectations for yourself and for your kid. You're not going to be perfect all the time. Neither are they. People mess up, and that's okay. And also create space for fun. We don't want to be so focused on our kids doing everything that they're supposed to do and, really like focusing only on school or extracurriculars. We also just want them to relax and have fun, because that's what life is about. All right. So now, in the interest of time, let's kind of go through this, and then at the end, I can take questions of all kinds. So let's talk a little bit about relationships. All relationships are important and can be supportive and enriching for kids and teenagers. So how do we guide teens to create healthy and positive relationships with their friends, romantic relationships, with your family, also just positive adult influences, and with themselves, right? Like how to be confident and sure of themselves, and how to have, kind of the resilience to get through things as they come up. So first and foremost, again, talk about it. So be receptive to whatever your kid brings you. So you can be concerned and you can express concern without expressing judgment, right? So you don't have to, if your kid comes to you and is like, hey, I drank for the first time, you can be like, ooh, like in your head, like, what? Are you kidding? You did what? But outwardly, maybe ask about it first, express your concern, be like, I think you're a little bit too young for that. I don't really like that you did that. This is why I'm worried about it. How did you think, or how did you feel about it? What do you think? Is this something you would try again? So on and so forth. Make it a conversation and not a punishment. Also, model acceptance, right? So I think we can be hard on ourselves, so then kids also are hard on themselves by extension, because they see that that's how we're acting, so then they also act that way. And you can do that by modeling acceptance of them, and also of, their peers, whoever you're hearing about, right? So maybe if they're talking about something that's going on in school, that's a good time to be like, yeah, sounds like that kid is really going through a hard time, rather than, maybe judging the kid outwardly, because you want to show your child that you're going to be there for them regardless of what's going on. Be super conscious of how you talk to your teen, especially about things like body image and about shaming and guilt, and also especially how you talk to yourself, because you as a parent might be like, oh, I really need to go on a diet, I really need to lose some weight, but your child, who maybe doesn't have any health concerns, is listening to you and thinking like, oh, okay, maybe that means I need to do that, right? So we want to be super conscious of how we talk about things, about health and wellness over, physical appearance as much as possible. Try to use inclusive and empathetic language. So by this, I mean, a pretty easy example of this is when your kid is, younger and we're kind of like, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? A good way to talk to your child about that is to remove gender from that conversation, right? So instead of saying like, oh, do you like any boys at school to your daughter, you can say, oh, do you have a crush at anyone at school? Or do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, right? Like if you want to make it clear that you are accepting of your child no matter what, then you can do that in a really subtle way, literally just by using language that shows that you would be okay with anything that they do, right? So that's just one example. Be honest about your concerns, right? So if you feel the example here is that your child is being bullied, you can say, yeah, it kind of feels like that friend is bullying you. Or I see that you feel really pressured to do what your boyfriend wants. And really express it as an observation. And then ask, like, how do they feel about it? Do they notice that? What can you do to help? And how can you be supportive? We never want to attack or come at them hard and be like, yeah, can't you see that he's bullying you, right? Because maybe they do see that or maybe they don't, but now all of a sudden they've learned that you are not their supporter in that situation, right? You're another aggressor. So one of the biggest kind of positive earmarkers in a child's mental health is a supportive family relationship. So how do we do that, especially when we get to teenagers who are pretty resistant to spending time with adults, right? Like you used to be the coolest person in the room and all of a sudden your teenager can't even look at you. So part of that is brain development, right? Like part of that is just like they're going through it. They have hormones, they have all this stuff that's changing around them and they're just figuring it out. So that's part of it. Also, your relationship with them is changing. When a child is much younger, they are much more dependent on you. You give them permission for things. They need things from you. They need a lot of nurturing, especially physical nurturing from you. So hugs, kisses, cuddles. As they get older, they're trying to be a little bit more independent. They want to make their own decisions. Many a teenager will think that they are an adult, whether or not they are. So really trying to be cognizant of that. And instead of trying to keep your child younger, right, and engage with them the way you did when they were younger, really try to facilitate independence and what I like to call safe control, right? Your 13, 16, 18-year-old does not have the life knowledge that you do, right? They don't have the brain development that you do. That's true. But there are certain things that they can control, right? They can and should control their extracurriculars, what job they work at, what time they do certain things. They have the ability to control those things. And the more you try to squash that, the more you're going to see a lot of rebellion and a lot of fighting. And you really want to model as much acceptance as possible. And you want to facilitate independence, right? Like you want your kid ultimately when they leave your home to be functional without you, right? That's always the goal. How do you teach your child to be a complete and whole and safe adult outside of your home? So I encourage everyone to consider, what is my role? How can I act in a way that furthers my child's development, which is important because sometimes I think as parents, we really struggle with what the next move could be, right? And so the important thing is to consider like, okay, what's going to help my child in the future, right? How can I support them in such a way that the next time they can support themselves? You could absolutely adapt consequences to match development, right? So you know how little kids would get a timeout. Maybe a kid a little bit older would get grounded. Maybe a kid a little bit older loses the car. Whatever it happens to be, consider how old your child is, right? It's just like you're not going to give 17-year-old a spanking, right? Like you're not going to do it. So you have to adapt, right? A lot of the time, this means taking away some independence. Sometimes maybe it means not allowing them to do preferred activities until they finish what they're supposed to do, but make sure that it makes sense for their age. Avoid power struggles. This is a big one, right? This is a huge one. I see it a lot with teens and parents where I think parents are really clinging to, kind of what they've decided that their rules are, and kids are really clinging to whatever it is that they really want to do. And, all of that is avoidable by considering what your child is asking for, right? Consider whether it makes sense. Like, can you meet that? Like, is it a reasonable request? If yes, okay, now do you want to do it or not do it and why? If it's not a reasonable request, how can you explain that to your child and how can you maybe come to a compromise with something that is more reasonable, right? So Maybe your 16-year-old cannot take the car on a 6-day road trip alone with their friends, right? Maybe that's not a reasonable request. But what are the parameters for that, right? How can we reach a middle ground that it does allow them a little bit of independence that you feel comfortable with, that you feel comfortable supporting? Please be patient with your child. It's really, really hard work to grow. It's really hard work to be a teenager, and it's really hard work to deal with parents. But especially have patience with yourself, because it is even harder to be a parent watching your child do all of those things. So facilitating supportive friendships for your teen is a little bit harder. Teen friendships are really complicated, right? Like dynamics change often. There can be bullying, there can be peer pressure, um, there can be kind of like weird things that you don't really understand, like why do they all need to sit at the certain lunch table? These girls are fighting all the time, but why are they still calling themselves best friends? Like so on and so forth, right? Um, So try to point out observations without judgment, like we talked about earlier. So maybe be like, I noticed that you and your friend are always fighting. Like, what's going on with that? Is everything okay? And also, I really encourage pro-social activities. One thing that we have found is that kids from all walks of life do much, much better when they don't have too much free time, right? They should be doing things that further their development. So I strongly advise against your child coming home and just studying more, right? Like once they do their homework, that's not really great. But can they be furthering their development in other ways? Can they can they have a job? Can they participate in a club or an activity of some kind? So really, kind of keep them involved with their community as much as possible. Teens and relationships. So this is a little bit harder, right? It's important to set boundaries ahead of time. So before children start dating. So talk it over with your partner and with your kid. When is dating allowed? What are the rules around dating? Talk about physical intimacy, right? Talk about safety, healthy versus unhealthy relationships. Your goal is really to make yourself a safe person, right? So remember that talking about these topics does not make your child more likely to engage in these behaviors. It makes them be better prepared, right? So talking to your kid about sex is the difference between it's not the difference between whether or not they'll have sex. It's the difference between will they be prepared in the event that they do have sex, right? Or if they're choosing not to do that, it will help them be prepared to make that decision, right? Talking to your child about physical abuse is a way to prevent it from happening, right? Or if it does happen, it's a way to make sure that they know that they can come to you about it. The goal is to make yourself as open as possible, even if you have concerns, so that your child will come and talk to you. And that way you can be a supportive person. And if there is ever, God forbid, an unsafe or unhealthy situation, then you are then a safe person to help your child navigate it. So some frequently asked questions. What if my teen wants to date before I think they are ready? Discuss your boundaries again. Ask your child what they want, what it means, and why. So, for example, I think, for younger kids, sometimes like dating just means that they say that they're dating and like nothing else happens after that. For older kids, obviously, it's a little bit different. So, ask why, right? Like, do they like someone at school? Are all their friends dating? Whatever it is, really try to be aware of kind of what is going on, why they want what they want. Recognize what's in your control and what's not, right? Remember that like just because they're not telling you about it doesn't mean that it's not happening and you can't control that. Um, and really like you want to be someone they talk to about that stuff as much as possible. And consider compromise, right? Like maybe you said you were like, you know what, like no boyfriends till you're married, never again. And then you're kind of like, okay, maybe that's not super realistic. Maybe, they really like this kid. Maybe, if we let it happen, if we let them go on a date, then maybe, we could be a part of that and we can get to know this kid too. Another question, how do I talk to my child about physical intimacy? Ideally, bring up physical intimacy before it is relevant to your child. I always advocate that all sexual education should happen early. So that includes bodies changing and that includes actual sex. Give clear and direct information. So no euphemisms, right? Be super direct, explain what can happen, explain the risks. Recognize that your kid probably is not always going to share with you what's going on with them and their partner. So offer the information even if your child doesn't ask for it, right? So where do you get birth control? what is consent? This is actually a really big one. I encourage all parents to talk to their kid about it. What does it mean to consent to physical intimacy? What does it mean to not consent, right? And remember always that we should always, always, always assume it's a no unless it's explicitly a yes, particularly within this age demographic where they're really, really struggling to figure things out. And obviously, health and safety is important. Another question I get often is, what can I do if my child is in an unhealthy, toxic, or messy relationship? Show empathy, right? Again, discuss concerns without judgment. Understand that your kid may choose to remain in that relationship despite your concerns, right? Maybe you hate their significant other, but they're still going to choose to be with that person. So make sure that you are a safe person. Encourage your kid to participate in therapy, and also really encourage them to participate in group activities, sports, extracurriculars, anything that gives them a little bit of insulation, a little bit of resilience, so that they have other voices in their head, right? If you're seeing that a relationship is toxic, right, then you want to do what you can to be a supportive person yourself, and also to encourage many, many other supportive people, activities, and kind of perspectives in your child's life. And now I guess time for questions. And then here are some resources. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but if anybody wants those resources, I'm happy to share it again at the end. I just want to be able to see if people have any questions for me.
So, Gauri, a couple of questions came in separately. So, one question is, if parents have a child who is, 18, 19, 20, and they realize that they are having some mental health concerns, but the teenager or the young adult refuses to go for treatment, and and they see that child has, left the studies and not concentrating, what can they do?
This is for college age students.
Yes, like, just started college last year.
So you're in a tricky situation here in that when they're 18, it is their choice, usually. The exception to this is if they are a danger to themselves and others, in which case they could be held against their will, but oftentimes that's not the case. Um, Unfortunately, here, all you can do is, again, be a safe person, care for your child, express empathy for your child, try to talk to your child and understand where they're coming from, offer resources, offer support, and then understand also ultimately that it is their choice, regardless of what you do.
So this becomes a very painful situation for parents when they see that they cannot help the child and the child is staying with them. Is there any way that they can go to a hospital or maybe the educational establishments for additional help?
You can certainly call 911 if you think it's appropriate.
Mm.
You can also reach out to health providers, but if your child isn't willing to see them, then I think you're kind of in the same situation that you were before. So um, I think if you're legitimately concerned immediately for your child's safety, then 911 is probably your best option.
Got it. Another question was, in the last year or so, they've noticed that their teenager, a high school student, has attempted, to take their own life. Was it simply COVID, or what has been going on? Is it an accumulation of stress in these teenagers?
That's hard to say because that's such a, for most people, that's such a complex decision. I would say I have seen, not necessarily, at least in my experience, I've not necessarily seen a spike in suicidality, although that may be true. And just, I'm not seeing it.
Just
What I'm
attempt
seeing
to,
within,
like, in trying to cut, but they know that it's not going to cut completely, or like
you're saying more like self-harming.
yes, self-harming is a right word.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen necessarily an uptick in that. I have seen a significant uptick in depression. So I think that you know, it's possible that COVID contributed to that. It's likely even that the intense isolation and like that huge change contributed to that. Um, I can't say definitively, but what I will say is that if that is a concern that you have for your child with self-harm, for example, I would immediately seek out a physician or a therapist who can give you more information as it relates to your child specifically. But then I would also I would really try and identify, like talk to your kid about it immediately, really identify what the source is for them, what's going on for them, and try to address that.
Sanjeevni also got an email from a parent whose child is 8 years old, and I know you work a lot with kids. This kid, a primary, elementary school student, tried to harm himself with a kitchen knife, and the parent tried to ask, well, what's bothering her, and we do not even know if a child exactly understands what is stress, what is
Mhm.
depression, or what are the concerns. What may be some of the reasons that the child as young has to take such an action?
It could be depression, right? Like, so we don't always have to be able to name a feeling to
Mhm,
feel that feeling. So it could be
mhm,
depression, it could be just anger. If there
mhm,
was a lot of life changes, a lot of instability going on,
mhm,
sometimes it can be some early mental illness concerns too.
mhm,
So
mhm.
the best thing to do at that point is to take your child to the physician, to their
Right.
pediatrician.
Since the child is really young, at least they can take care of that.
Yeah.
There was one more question on the Sanjeevni email box. Quite often, when they go to a medical professional or a therapist, medicines are prescribed, and the parents are hesitant that their teenager or their young adult take those medicines. What are your thoughts? Like, should they be fun? It's a doctor who's given that the medicines to them, but they're like, afraid of side effects or what may happen.
So, okay, medication is never a life sentence, right? So every kid is different. Every kid's needs are different. Do not be afraid of medication. Now, it's not, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily it needs to be our first go-to, right? You can try many other things first. But also, I mean, you know, consider why it's being prescribed, whether it's bringing any relief to your child. Also, try to pay attention and see, like, for some kids, like they don't need it, right? Some kids are able to use coping skills, they're able to go to therapy. In this case, if your child has been prescribed medication, it could be useful to get an opinion from a therapist or a psychologist just to see whether they feel the medication is necessary also. So the times when I have pushed for medication is when the child is doing everything else that I have recommended, right? So they're doing all of their coping skills, they're kind of they're reaching out to the people they're supposed to reach out to, and it doesn't really seem like it's working. And at that time I get a lot of parent resistance being like, oh, they're so young. And it's like, yeah, they're young, right? So they shouldn't be living their life feeling this way if there's a way to really help them. And consider that anything else that was going on with your child, if your child needed cholesterol medication, if your child needed diabetes medication, heart medication, you wouldn't stand in their way. So there's absolutely no reason to stand in their way now.
Right. One more question came in. In fact, two parents had similar questions. So they discovered that their young teenager had mental health concerns, when that particular youth was in high school.
Mhm.
Uh, Maybe due to other reasons, no treatment was possible at that point of time. Now they are in their mid 20s, and it appears the parent, the the problem has really persisted, and it's affecting their day-to-day life. And once again, this adult is refusing any kind of treatment. The parents' question is, what else can they do if the young adult refuses treatment outrightly? And apparently, that problem was happening for the last 10 years or so. And this is the concluding question.
I mean, it's an adult, right? A young adult child. I think it's the same as before, unfortunately. I think you can, again, like you can be a safe person for your child and you can really encourage them to do something that would help them, but ultimately they're adults and it's their choice.
Thank you so much, Gauri. A very useful presentation and very informative. And I hope everyone who's watching, if they have a need to talk to Gauri directly, you can reach to the Sanjeevni helpline number, and Gauri's contact will be shared. Uh, May is Mental Health Awareness. We sincerely want everyone take care of their mental health as they take care of the physical health. Any parting words, Gauri?
No, I think, just remember, right, that this is really hard. It's really confusing to navigate for everybody. Being a parent is really hard, being a kid is really hard, and all you can really do is your best, and it's going to be fine.
Thanks again. Thanks a lot, Gauri, for your time. And thanks everyone who's watching this. Have a
All right,
great
thank
day,
you.
everyone. Bye.